Picture human evolution. There's a good chance one specific image is already forming. A line of figures, left to right, hunched and knuckle-dragging on one end, upright and modern on the other. You've seen it on t-shirts, in textbooks, as the punchline of 100 jokes. It's called the March of Progress, and it's one of the most reproduced scientific images of the 20th century. Delete it right now before a single fossil enters this story. It has to go. Not because the artist got the anatomy wrong, because the image delivers a conclusion before you've seen a shred of evidence. A straight line, a single destination, a march with a beginning and an end. Once that picture is lodged in your head, it's almost impossible to look at an actual fossil without unconsciously forcing it onto that line, whether it belongs there or not. So, there was no march. What happened across roughly 7 million years looked far less like a parade and far more like a bush, branches shooting off in every direction, most ending in nothing, a small number eventually producing us. And for nearly all of that 7 million years, no participant had any idea which branches were which. I'm not asking you to take that on faith. Every section that follows hands you a piece of evidence for it. One more thing needs to go while I'm clearing ground. You did not evolve from monkeys. That sentence gets repeated so often it barely registers as a claim anymore. But it isn't what happened. You and every monkey alive today share a common ancestor, a creature neither lineage had ever laid eyes on, existing millions of years before either one looked anything like it does now. You're not descendants of monkeys, you're cousins, distant but real. Now scale. 7 million years is a number that sounds impressive. It means almost nothing, because human brains aren't built to fill a span that long. So try this instead. Compress the whole 7 million year story into a single calendar year. And every scrap of recorded human history, every pyramid, every empire, every war, every book ever written, fits into the last few seconds before midnight on December 31st. Everything this video is about to walk you through happens in a stretch of time so vast that history, as you understand it, is a rounding error tacked unto the very end. And a quick note on vocabulary while we're here, because loose words carry hidden assumptions, and this story has been damaged by loose words before. A hominin is any species more closely related to humans than to chimpanzees. A wide technical category, not a badge of honor. A hominid is the broader family that includes every great ape. And ape itself isn't an insult. And it isn't a stage you eventually grow out of. You are one right now. So how do we actually know any of what's coming? Because that's the other thing with the March of Progress image. It conveniently hides. It shows you conclusions with the work erased. Real paleoanthropology looks nothing like a tidy silhouette lineup. It's radiometric dating, measuring the decay of radioactive elements trapped in a volcanic ash to pin down with real precision how old a layer of Earth actually is. It's stratigraphy, reading layers of rock and sediment the way you read pages in a book. Oldest at the bottom, most recent at the top. And it's an almost unreasonable about inference, built from an almost unreasonably small amount of physical material. An entire theory of how a creature walked, reconstructed from a fragment of a hip bone that is smaller than your own hand. Hold on to that toolkit. Every method named here will be put to work on an actual fossil before this vid is finished. One more piece of context before we actually start moving. Nearly every fossil you're about to meet in this story comes from one of two regions: the East African Rift Valley or the cave systems of southern Africa. That clustering is real, and the next section will explain why it actually exists, because the reason has less to do with where our ancestors really lived and more to do on which parts of this vast continent happen to be good at preserving bone in the first place. Here's the image I'm replacing the March of Progress with, and it's going to grow branch by branch, section by section for the rest of this vid. Right now, picture it bare. A single point, 7 million years back, where two lineages that used to be one began to drift apart. No shape yet, no direction, just a beginning. 7 million years. A bush, not a ladder, a cousin, not an ancestor, staring back at you the next time you make eye contact with a monkey. Now, let's find out what we can actually see and what we still can't. Before I introduce a single named fossil, before you meet the first upright ape, before Lucy, I need to tell you something about the map you're going to be looking at for the rest of this story. That map has a pattern baked into it, and if I don't explain that pattern now, it's going to quietly teach you the wrong lesson. Here's the pattern. Nearly every major hominin fossil discovery comes from one of two places: the Rift Valley of East Africa, so we're talking Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, or the limestone cave systems of southern Africa, concentrated heavily in South Africa. Pull up any serious map of major fossil sites, and this is exactly what you'll see. Two dense clusters, and between and around them, a whole continent's worth of comparatively empty space. It would be easy, staring at that map, to draw an obvious conclusion. This is where it happened. Everywhere else is blank because everywhere else, nothing much was going on. That conclusion is almost certainly wrong, or at least badly incomplete. The real explanation has less to do with ancient biology than it does with rock, rainfall, and where scientists happen to go digging. The rift's own advantages, why its violent, fracturing geology may have actively shaped human evolution, deserves the next section's full attention. But there's a separate, simpler reason it dominates the fossil record first. It's extraordinarily good at making and preserving fossils in general. Volcanic eruptions, common across this unstable, tearing landscape, bury things in ash. And ash is a remarkable preservative, protecting bone from the scavengers, weather, and decay that would otherwise destroy it within years. Southern Africa's caves work through an entirely different mechanism, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms. Certain limestone systems, under the right chemical conditions, slowly encase bones that fall or wash into them inside a hardened, mineral-rich rock called breccia, sealing the remains inside of a natural stone that can protect them for millions of years. Nothing to do with volcanoes, a completely separate geological accident, producing a completely separate pocket of fossil wealth. Now, let's talk about the Congo Basin, the vast stretch of Central African rainforest sitting between these two fossil-rich regions, covering an area larger than many countries combined. This region has produced comparatively few hominin fossils. And here's the uncomfortable point this section exists to make. That's almost certainly not because nothing happened here. It's because almost nothing that happens there survives long enough to even be found. Rainforest soil is acidic, wet, and biologically relentless. Exactly the conditions that break bone down quicker than preserving it. There's little to no volcanic ash falling here to bury and protect remains, There's no equivalent of southern Africa's cave systems. And dense vegetation makes it extraordinarily difficult to even spot a fossil at the surface, the way an eroding gully in a drier landscape might expose one to a researcher walking by. If a hominin lived, died, and was buried somewhere in Central Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago, the conditions there have been working against that story from ever reaching us. And I want to point out a second factor real quick alongside that geology, because this isn't purely a story about rock and rainfall. Decades of paleoanthropological fieldwork, the funding, the institutions, the expeditions, have concentrated disproportionately in the East and Southern Africa, partly a rational response to better preservation, but partly too simply a reflection of where the search had historically been, for reasons that have nothing to do with hominins actually lived. So carry this forward into every fossil this video introduces from here on out. The map ahead is real, rigorously dated, scientifically solid. It is also almost certainly an incomplete picture of a full geographic range of everything this story. Somewhere beneath the Congo rainforest right now, there may be fossils that could rewrite the entire section of this story. We don't know. And here's the harder truth. We may never know. Not because nobody's looked hard enough, but because the very conditions needed to preserve that evidence may simply not exist there, regardless of effort or funding or the next expedition. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It might just be evidence of a rainforest doing exactly what rainforests do to bone. Next, we finally head into the Rift Valley itself, not to just explain why it preserves so much of this story, but why its violence may have actively caused so much of it to happen there in the first place. We left off with a bare tree and a single question mark. 7 million years ago, two lineages that used to be one started drifting apart. One became every chimpanzee alive today, the other became you. But why here? Why not somewhere else on Earth? And why then specifically? The old answer was simple, tidy, and too simple to be true. You've probably heard it. Forests thinned, grassland spread, and our ancestors stood up to see over the tall grass. Clean cause, clean effect. The savannah made us stand up. It's a good story. It's also not what the evidence supports. I'll come back to exactly why once we meet the first upright fossils. For now, hold on to this. Whatever caused bipedalism, it wasn't one single simple event. So what was actually happening on the ground? The continent was tearing itself apart, not metaphorically, literally, along a line running through modern Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania. The Earth's crust was pulling apart at the seams. Magma pushed up from below. The ground cracked, buckled, dropped. Mountains rose on either side of the widening fracture. This is the East African Rift, one of the most violent, active pieces of geology on the planet. And our earliest ancestors lived their entire lives on top of it. A rift doesn't crack once and settle. It keeps moving for millions of years, lifting land, dropping it elsewhere, redirecting rivers, closing off lakes, and opening new ones. The environment on top never settled into one stable type either. Forest, one stretch of millennia, open woodland the next, grassland after that. Then back again, as rainfall shifted with that changing terrain. Picture trying to build an entire evolutionary strategy on ground that keeps changing the rules under your feet. That's increasingly how researchers read this period. Not one clean environmental push, but a mosaic, switching constantly, rewarding flexibility over specialization. A creature that could only thrive in dense forests was in trouble. So, was one that could only thrive on open grassland. The advantage went to whatever could move between both. This same fracturing landscape is also the reason the last section's map looks the way it does, and it's worth closing that loop properly. Volcanic ash preserves bone with remarkable fidelity and can be dated with real precision using the methods already introduced. Rift valleys, filling with sediment over millions of years, trap and preserve remains in a way flatter landscapes and rainforests, as I just spent a section explaining, simply don't. East Africa's fossil abundance isn't only about where human origins happened, it's also about where the geology happened, to be unusually good at recording it. None of this tells us exactly why bipedalism happened, or what is it for. That comes with our first actual bipedal fossils in the very next section. What this section is actually about is narrower, and in its own way, more important. Africa was never simply a stage that things happened to be standing on. The ground itself was doing something, fracturing, rising, flooding, drying over and over for millions of years. And whatever eventually stood up on two legs did so on some of the most unstable, unpredictable terrain on the entire planet. Keep that instability in mind. It's about to become the stage for the first fossils in our tree. One piece of housekeeping before we meet anyone, because it matters for everything that follows. I'm about to introduce 3 different fossils from 3 different places spanning several million years. It will be tempting to line them up in your head. First this one, then this one, each a little more advanced than the last. Resist that. These are not 3 rungs on a ladder. They're 3 separate branches found in 3 separate places, and in at least one case, found somewhere you would not expect at all. Let's start there, with the surprise. Given everything just established about a fracturing volcanic rift, you'd reasonably expect the first upright ape to turn up somewhere along it. Instead, the oldest candidate we have, dated to roughly 7 million years ago, comes from Chad, Central Africa. Nowhere near the rift. Its name is Sahelanthropus chadensis. Its nickname is Tumai. What we actually have of it is frankly not much. Mostly a skull, battered and reconstructed from fragments, found in an ancient lakeside and woodland environment far to the west of everywhere you have been told to look. It's important to be honest about the limits here. With a skull this incomplete, the case for upright walking is real and it's taken seriously, but genuinely contested rather than settled. And what does this battered skull actually tell us? This is where the detective work starts. Paleoanthropologists look at the foramen magnum, the hole at the base of the skull where the spinal cord exits. In an animal that walks on all fours, that hole points backward, trailing a horizontal spine. In an animal that walks upright, it shifts underneath the skull, balanced atop a vertical spine. Tumai's foramen magnum sits further forward than a chimpanzee's. A hint argued over but taken seriously, of at least some upright posture. From one hole in one battered skull, a claim about how an entire creature moved through the world. If the very first candidate for an upright ape turns up this far outside the rift, then whatever was happening 7 million years ago wasn't confined to one dramatic, cracking strip of geology. It was happening more broadly across a wider Africa than any single storyline could hold. The bush isn't just branching through time, it's branching through geography too, from the very first fossil we have. Now to Kenya, the Tugen Hills, solidly back in rift territory, roughly 6 million years ago. This is Ororin to Genesis, and here the evidence shifts from skull to leg, a thigh bone with a specific internal structure at the point where it meets the hip. carries a load-bearing signature consistent with an animal that habitually walked upright, distributing weight the way a two-legged walker does rather than a knuckle-walking climber. Different bone, different method, same underlying question. And finally, Ethiopia's Afar region, roughly 4.4 million years ago. Ardipithecus, named Ardi, the most complete and most informative of the three by a wide margin, and the one that complicates the story in the most useful way. Ardi's pelvis is shorter and broader than a chimpanzee's, bowl-shaped, built to support an upright body. That fits the pattern, but look at her foot and the story gets stranger. Ardi's big toe splays outward, away from the other toes, the way a chimpanzee's does for gripping branches, not the way yours does, tucked inline for pushing off the ground while walking. Part upright walker, part still a climber, a creature genuinely caught between two ways of moving. Not a clean transitional stage, quietly ticking a box on the way to becoming us. That divergent toe is the clearest possible proof this was never a smooth, linear process. If evolution was building towards a destination, you'd expect steady improvement, a little more human with each fossil. Instead, 4.5 million years in, a creature still built to grab a branch with her foot if she needed to. Nobody told Ardi she was supposed to be further along, because there was no further along, only what worked for her on the specific unstable patch of Africa she happened to live in. Here's the detail tying all three together, and the one worth holding onto most tightly in every case. Tumai or Orin Ardi. The brain stayed small, ape-sized. Whatever was driving these bodies to experiment with upright walking, it wasn't a bigger brain arriving first. The body moved first, not the mind. I'm not going to tell you why bipedalism happened. Nobody can with full confidence. Carrying food, temperature regulation, seeing over vegetation, freeing the hands, probably some combination, and proportions still argued over. What the fossils show plainly, upright walking, early, uneven, in more than one place at once, and brains the whole time staying exactly where they always had been. 3 branches, 3 distinct regions of one enormous continent. One very small, very stubborn toe still reaching for a branch that isn't there anymore. Every family tree eventually produces a member everyone's heard of. Ours is a partial skeleton, barely 3.5 feet tall, found in Ethiopia in 1974, and given a name from a Beatles song playing on repeat at the dig camp that night. Her name is Lucy, and there's a good chance you've been taught to think about her wrong. Here's the version most people carry around. Lucy is the missing link, the fossil that connects ape to human, the one crucial piece that closes the gap. It's a phrase that sounds like a praise. It is actually the march of progress sneaking back in the side door, dressed up as one specific, beloved skeleton instead of a cartoon diagram. The missing link implies a single chain with a single missing piece, and Lucy conveniently slotted into the gap. That's not what she is. Lucy isn't a link, she's one member, one very well preserved member of a species that had cousins, contemporaries, and overlapping relatives crowding the same stretch of time. Calling her the link erases every single one of them. Her species is Australopithecus afarensis, and what makes her genuinely remarkable isn't that she's unique, it's that she's roughly 40% complete, which for a skeleton this old is extraordinary. A small ape-sized brain, clear anatomical evidence of upright walking, some retained adaptations for climbing, because the transition away from the trees clearly wasn't finished yet, even here, 500,000 years past Artie. But if you want the single most direct piece of evidence that Afarensis walked upright, you don't need Lucy's bones at all. You need a stretch of hardened volcanic ash in a place called Litoli in Tanzania, laid down 3.6 million years ago. Here's what happened there, as close as I can reconstruct it. A nearby volcano erupted, blanketing the ground in fine ash. Rain fell shortly after, turning that ash into something like wet cement. Across that wet cement, 2, quite possibly 3 individuals walked, leaving their footprints behind before the ash hardened into rock and locked those prints in place for the next 3.5 million years. Sit with what that actually is. Not a bone, not an inference built from a foramen magnum or a femur's internal structure. However solid that inference might be, an actual physical record of an actual afternoon millions of years ago. The closest thing paleoanthropology has to a photograph. You can measure the stride length and see how these individuals were walking upright together on 2 legs. No different in basic mechanics from your own footprints in wet sand. Now, the part of this section that has nothing to do with footprints or fossils and everything to do with how badly the search for African origins was mishandled for decades. In 1924, a South African anatomist named Raymond Dart examined the skull of a young child found near the town of Tong and concluded it belonged to an early human ancestor. Genuinely ancient, upright walking, small-brained African. He was right, and for the better part of 30 years, much of the European scientific establishment mocked him for it. The evidence was not perfect, one juvenile skull rarely is, and that thinness gave skeptics a genuine, if narrow, foothold. But the weakness of the evidence alone cannot explain the hostility Dart encountered, or the decades it took for this conclusion to be accepted. What stood in the way of scientific establishment heavily invested in the idea that human origins belong somewhere else. Asia, Europe, anywhere but Africa, and unwilling to accept a small child's skull from South Africa as proof that the cradle of humanity sat on a continent so many of them had already decided could not have produced it. Dart was eventually fully vindicated. The Tong child is now recognized as one of the foundational discoveries in the field, but eventually took decades, for reasons that go well beyond the strength of bones themselves. Lucy and the Tong child did not exist alone either, and this is worth naming without even dwelling on each name individually. Australopithecus setaba garhi anaminitus, a genus that Paranthropus, cousins and contemporaries, overlapping in time, some possibly overlapping with Lucy's own species directly. Nobody knows, currently, with full confidence, which of these branches led where, or which simply ran their course and stopped. That uncertainty isn't a hole in the story. It's the honest shape of a genuinely crowded moment, a bush at its bushiest so far. 2 things to carry forward. First, Lucy is not a link in a chain. She's one voice in a crowd. The best recorded member of a species that was never alone. And second, the fight to get the world to accept that this crowd was African at all was never simply a matter of finding better evidence. Sometimes the evidence was already there. What took time was getting people to actually believe it. Every branch we've met so far has carried at least some feature that feels familiar. Upright posture, human-like walking, hands increasingly free from locomotion. This one looks different, and that's exactly why it matters. Meet Paranthropus, three related species known to specialists as Aethiopicus, robusticus, and boisei. Though boisei has a nickname worth knowing on its own, Nutcracker Man. Before we get any further, it's important to be clear about what this branch is not. It is not a failed attempt at becoming human. It is not a rough draft, a wrong turn, or an evolutionary dead end in the sense that implies something went wrong. It is a separate, successful lineage that lived alongside our own ancestors for well over 1 million years. Longer, in fact, than Homo sapiens. Our own species has existed on Earth. And then, in its own time, it ended. Not because it failed, because everything eventually ends. Look at what actually made Paranthropus distinctive, and you'll notice something almost paradoxical. This is, by a wide margin, the most dramatically specialized anatomy we've encountered yet in this story. And it belongs to the branch that did not survive. A massive, bony ridge, a sagittal crest, runs along the top center of the skull, from front to back, exactly like the ones you'd find on a modern gorilla. It exists to anchor enormous jaw muscles. Those muscles, in turn, power some of the largest, flattest molars of any hominin on record, backed by a heavy, reinforced jaw built to withstand serious repeated force. Put all that together and you're not looking at a general purpose skull. You're looking at a highly specialized grinding machine built for tough, fibrous plant material a less specialized jaw could not handle. One caveat matters here, though. More recent dental isotope and microwear evidence complicates the simple picture that the jaw alone suggests that the actual diet may have been more varied than just tough food specialist implies. Even here, the evidence resists such a tidy story. Now here's the number worth sitting with, because it's this section's real point. Paranthropus persisted in some form for well over 1 million years. Homo sapiens, you, everyone you've ever met, every human being currently alive, has existed for something closer to like 300,000 years as we know it. Paranthropus outlasted us before we even existed. That number should do something to how you think about extinct. We tend to hear that word and picture failure, a lineage that could not hack it, doomed from the start. Paranthropus asks you to picture something else instead. A genuinely long, genuinely successful run on its own terms that simply, eventually came to an end. Longevity and survival to the present are not the same measurement. One branch in this story happens to still be walking around making videos about it. That's not the same as being the only branch that had ever worked. So why did it end somewhere around 1 million years ago? We don't fully know. Shifting climate patterns may have altered the specific plants Paranthropus depended on. That same extreme dietary specialization that made it so successful for so long may have become a liability once the conditions had changed. Competition from other hominins sharing the same landscape may have also played a role. Most likely, some combination of all three. In proportions nobody can currently prove, though. That uncertainty isn't a gap in our storytelling, it's currently just the honest state of the evidence. What we do know is this. For well over 1 million years, two very different solutions to the same basic evolutionary problem existed side by side on the same African landscape. One specialized hard, built an extraordinary jaw, and thrived on tough vegetation for longer than recorded human history could fit inside twice over. Other hominins, some small-jawed and less specialized, were simultaneously experimenting with different diets, different behaviors, and eventually stone technology. They happen to still be here afterward. That's not a hierarchy. That's just how it happened to go. Paranthropus was never trying to become us. It didn't need to. It had already succeeded on its own terms for longer than we even have had the chance to show off today. Here it is, The moment our own genus enters the story. Homo. If you felt something shift when you heard that word, a little more attention, a little more anticipation, maybe even the quiet expectation that things are about to get serious now that we've arrived. That's worth noticing. It's exactly the reaction this section needs to gently take apart. Because here's the truth about the beginning of Homo. It's not a clean line. It's not a clean threshold. It is, if anything, the blurriest boundary we've encountered yet in this entire video. So blurry that paleoanthropologists examining the same fossils sometimes disagree about which side of the line a given specimen actually belongs on. Meet Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis, the earliest fossils generally placed in our own genus, dated from roughly 2.5 million years ago onward. And here's the part that should deflate any sense of arrival. Their brains are only modestly larger than the Australopithecines we just spent 2 sections with. Not a leap, a nudge. Some specimens classified as early Homo, by researchers' own admission, difficult to distinguish confidently from the late Australopithecus that we just were talking about. This is not, once again, a failure of the science. It's the science being honest with you. If we pretended this boundary was sharp and obvious just because name changes to something that sounded more like us, we'd be doing exactly what the March of Progress does. So if brain size doesn't cleanly mark this moment, what does? Honestly, nothing does. Not by itself. It's tempting to reach for a single clean answer here, and the traditional one has always been tools. But the archaeological record has gotten stranger than that in recent years. At a site called Lomekwi in Kenya, deliberately worked stone artifacts have been dated to roughly 3.3 million years ago. Hundreds of thousands of years before the earliest fossils confidently assigned to our own genus. At Nyawanga, an early Aldewan-style tool turned up directly associated with Paranthropus remains. And the very branch that we just spent an entire section insisting was never trying to become us, stone technology, in other words, doesn't belong neatly to Homo at all. We can't always identify whose hands were actually doing the striking. What we can say is narrower and still genuinely important. Across this period, stone tools become an increasingly central part of the survival strategy of the hominins living through it, Homo included. The technology most people picture as Homo's calling card is the Aldewan toolkit. A stone core, a hammerstone strike at the right angle, a sharp flake capable of cutting hide, removing flesh, and helping break into bone. Almost embarrassingly simple, but enormously useful. It made carcasses easier to process and opened more reliable access to calorie-rich animal tissue and marrow. Instead of evolving an entirely new chewing apparatus, a hominin could alter what its existing body was capable of through something it made. That's worth sitting with on its own terms now, because it's one of the biggest developments in this entire story. Technology functioning as a kind of external anatomy. A body extending what it could do without waiting for evolution to build the tool itself into bone and muscle. And this is where a real surprise still lives, even with the entrance badge idea retired. The intuitive story goes, intelligence arrives first, and tool making follows as its clever expression. The record says something closer to the opposite. Brains across this entire stretch had barely changed. Tools were already spreading anyway, across more than just one hominin lineage. If anything, the casual arrow may run the other direction. Reliable access to calorie-dense food, unlocked by a simple stone flake, may be part of what eventually fueled the brain growth that came later. Tool use as a cause sitting upstream of bigger brains, not a consequence sitting downstream from them. Now, we've seen this pattern before, and it's worth naming the echo directly. Walking came before smart. Now, it turns out tool making doesn't belong exclusively to smart either. This story keeps refusing to sort itself into the order you would expect. None of this would be known at all, in the detail we have it, without one specific place, Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where decades of patient, methodical excavation, led for much of the 20th century by Louis and Mary Leakey, built the entire framework researchers still use to read this period. The how we know is never incidental to the story. So, our own genus begins here, at least as far as the current evidence shows. Not with a triumphant leap, not with an obvious superior brain, not even with technology it can fully claim as its own, but with an ambiguous boundary and a barely changed skull. If that feels like an anticlimax, that's probably because it should. The story isn't rewarding you yet for having arrived at Homo. It's simply telling you, honestly, that this is where the blurry line currently sits in today's science and anthropological work. Everything up to this point has asked you to sit with ambiguity, blurry species boundaries, contested toes, tools that refuse to belong to any one lineage. That's been necessary, but it also by now 7 sections of careful hedging. This section is where the hedging finally lifts just a little bit, just a little bit. Meet Homo erectus, and meet specifically one of the most complete early hominin skeletons ever found. A boy, roughly 8 years old at the time of death, discovered near Kenya's lake Turkana, and known ever since simply as Turkana Boy. Where Lucy gave us roughly 40% of a skeleton, Turkana Boy gives researchers something close enough to complete that they can reconstruct with real confidence exactly what this body was built to do. And what it was built to do is walk and run, essentially the way you do. Long legs, proportioned much closer to a modern humans than anything we've encountered so far. Skeletal evidence consistent with an efficient long-distance walking and running gait. The kind of build researchers associate with reduced body hair and a heavier reliance on sweating for cooling. Though those particular soft tissue features can't be read directly off a skeleton and remain inference rather than direct observation. Still, in the parts that matter for locomotion, this is recognizably closer to a modern human body. The skull, though, is a different story, and that gap is worth sitting with rather than just pushing past. The brain, while larger than anything in the genus Homo we've met so far, is still meaningfully smaller than yours. Once again, the body modernizes well ahead of the mind. Now, the toolkit. If the last section left the boundaries of who made what genuinely blurry, Homo erectus' signature technology draws a sharper line. The Aculean hand axe, a deliberate symmetrical teardrop-shaped design, worked on both sides, requiring real skill and planning to produce correctly, a clear step up from anything before it. Here's the detail that should genuinely unsettle you a little. That exact design stays remarkably stable for over 1 million years. Not a few centuries, over 1 million years, across vast distances with only gradual incremental change. All of recorded history, agriculture, cities, writing, everything from the pyramids to right now, fits inside a span of time roughly just 6,000 years long. The hand axe outlasts that many times over. Essentially unchanged. A design that works and keeps working for well over 1 million years isn't just a failure of imagination. It's a genuinely extraordinary run of success on the terms that actually mattered to the creature that was using it. We should mention fire here too, carefully. Some researchers, most notably Richard Wrangham, have argued that cooking food using fire to make both meat and plant matter easier to digest and more caloric available may have been a significant driver of later brain growth in this lineage, sort of like how we discussed prior. It fits the diet and brain thread this story has been quietly building, but it remains a genuinely debated hypothesis, not a settled fact just yet. And now, the moment this entire video has been building toward. Homo erectus is the earliest hominin widely accepted to have left Africa. Fossils attributed to this species, or something very close to it, turn up as far away as the Dmanisi in the country of Georgia, in Java, and in China. Though the Dmanisi material specifically remains debated among specialists over exactly how it should be classified, whether the precise taxonomy settles into populations of this lineage walk distances that are difficult to fully comprehend. Using nothing but the body and the technology we just described, spreading across a continent's worth of territory and then well beyond it. We're not going to follow them out of Africa. We're not going to follow them out of Africa. That story, what happened to the populations that left, what they encountered and how far they eventually traveled, belongs to a different chapter of this series entirely. What matters right here is the fact itself. Africa did not just produce this lineage, Africa exported it successfully, repeatedly across a scale that connects a fossil bed in Kenya to one of Southeast Asia as the same species. Hold that fact loosely, do not chase it. Just notice that for the first time in 7 million years of this story, the walls of the continent that made the whole process possible had stopped being the walls of the story itself. A body built for distance, a tool good enough to not need improvement for over 1 million years, and a door standing open that we are deliberately not walking through just yet. After a section that finally felt like solid ground, a real body, a stable tool, a species literally walking off the continent, it would be reasonable to expect the story to keep gathering momentum from here. More confidence, fewer question marks. That is not what happens. What actually happens across the next 500,000 years or so is one of the murkiest, most genuinely contested stretches in this entire field. And rather than smooth over that murkiness for the sake of a tidier story, we're going to sit inside it. Because doing so is more useful than pretending we know things we do not. Here's the situation, stated as plainly as it can be. Paleoanthropologists working on this period frequently cannot agree on how to classify the fossils in front of them. You'll hear names like Homo heidelbergensis attached to specimens from this stretch of time, and it's worth being direct about what that name actually is. It is, in a large part, a placeholder, a working label applied to populations that share some features, differ in others, and don't cleanly match any tidy, agreed-upon species definition. Different researchers looking at similar or even identical evidence sometimes reach for different names entirely. This isn't sloppiness, it's what the frontier of a live scientific question actually looks like. So let's meet two of the specific fossils that anchor this murky period, because the confusion is easier to understand once it has real faces attached to it. In Zambia, at a site called Kabwe, sometimes called Broken Hill, a remarkably well-preserved skull was found in 1921. One of the most complete crania from this entire period found anywhere in the world. It shows a brain case larger than anything from Homo erectus, but a face and a heavy, jutting brow ridge that don't sit comfortably alongside a fully modern human either. Researchers have at various points classified it under the Homo heidelbergensis, and at other points argued it deserves its own separate designation entirely. A single skull, still actively unsettled and exactly where it belongs, more than a century after it was found. And then let's keep moving. In Ethiopia, at a site called Bodo, another skull shows its own distinct mix of older and newer features. And a detail worth pausing on, cut marks on the bone itself, evidence of deliberate processing by other hominins. Though exactly what that processing meant, ritually or otherwise, is itself argued, or rather being agreed upon. So different countries, different specific anatomy, both resisting easy placement on any tree you could draw with confidence. What we can say, broadly, is that brains during this period trend larger than what we saw in Homo erectus, and that material culture grows more sophisticated alongside them. Tools show more forethought, more complex construction, evidence of hafting a stone point onto a wooden shaft rather than simply gripping stone in hand, but resist connecting those two trends into a tidy cause and effect story. We can observe that both things are happening around the same time. We cannot yet confidently say that one of these things are driving the other. Here's the real question sitting at the center of this entire section. Who descends from whom? Does Kabwe's population lead somewhere specific, or does Bodo's? The honest answer from the specialists actually working on this material is that these relationships remain genuinely unsettled. Not unsettled until the next big find resolves it neatly, but unsettled in a way that may simply reflect how population history actually worked in this period. Messier, more overlapping, less like a family tree with clean lines and more like a series of related populations blending and diverging and blending again. In ways the fossil record alone may never fully untangle. Sometimes, serious researchers, decades into a serious study, arrive at a shrug instead of an answer. And that shrug is not a failure of the field, it's what real evidence sitting at the genuine edge of what we currently know actually looks like. So we're not going to force a family tree onto this stretch of time for the sake of narrative tidiness. What we can tell you is this. Somewhere in this tangled, only partially resolved 500,000 years, the populations that will eventually matter most to the rest of the story are already moving around, already varying place to place, already becoming something recognizably like you. We just don't know yet, with confidence, how exactly we got from here to there. Every fossil in this story so far has followed at least one predictable rule. Older bones look more primitive. Younger bones look more like us. It's not a perfectly clean rule. We spent 2 sections complicating it already. But it's held well enough that you can use it to make a rough guess about a fossil's age, just by looking at it. Of course, this section is about a fossil that breaks that rule outright. Its name is Homo naledi, and it was found in a chamber deep inside a South African cave system called Rising Star. A chamber so difficult to reach that the excavation team had to be selected specifically for their ability to fit through passages barely wide enough for a human body. The difficulty of reaching this fossil is itself part of the story of how we know what we know. Here's the anatomy. Homo naledi had a brain roughly a third the size of yours. Genuinely small, closer in scale to some of the earliest members of our genus than to anything modern. Small brain, primitive looking skull, a body with a curious mix of older and newer features throughout. If you'd had only heard that description, you'd reasonably guess this fossil belongs somewhere back in the tangled mess of that last section, or even earlier. Instead, the dating evidence places Homo naledi far more recently than its anatomy would ever predict. Recent enough that it had shared the African landscape with the early members of our own species. Sit with that, because it's the clearest possible violation of the rule the whole story has trained you to expect. A small brain and an old-looking anatomy is supposed to mean old. Here, it doesn't. Somewhere in Africa, a hominin with a brain the third of yours may have been alive at roughly the same time as creatures who had looked basically just like us. Primitive appearance and recency, it turns out, are not the same thing. And Naledi is the starkest possible proof of it. Now, the controversy. And this is a genuine live, unresolved argument happening right now among serious researchers. Not a settled finding we can just report to you. Lee Berger and his colleagues have argued for several remarkable possibilities all at once. Deliberate burial of the dead, engravings cut into cave walls, and the use of fire or artificial light to navigate deep into a system that would have required real effort and intention to access it at all. These are all separate claims, evaluated separately by the field, and it's worth keeping them that way rather than folding them into a package. If some of this holds up, it would mean a hominin with a brain a third the size of ours, engaging in behavior most researchers would have confidently assumed that would require a much larger brain to even manage. That's a big claim, and it has met real pushback on every front. Critics have raised specific concerns that the positioning of the remains could plausibly be explained by natural processes rather than a deliberate burial, that the engraving's age and intentionality are difficult to establish with confidence, that the dating and surrounding context of the purported fire evidence is disputed. Formal scientific review of these claims have continued to describe significant uncertainty rather than settled acceptance. This isn't a fringe objection against a settled consensus. It's an active, ongoing disagreement between credentialed specialists playing out in real time in the peer-reviewed literature right now. So we're not going to resolve it for you because it's not resolved. What I can tell you is what is actually at stake. Whether brain size and behavior complexity move together as tightly as most of this field has long assumed, or whether Naledi is proof that a small-brained hominin was capable of something far more sophisticated than its skull alone would suggest. There's one more thread worth pulling here now. We're only going to put it in part way, because full resolution belongs to a different chapter of this series entirely. Beyond Naledi's uncontested story, genetic research has increasingly turned up evidence of what researchers sometimes call ghost populations. Ancient African lineages that left a detectable trace in the DNA of people alive today. Without ever being matched to a specific fossil we can point to and name. Naledi shows us in bone that Africa held onto surprisingly small-brained relatives way longer than expected. The genetic evidence suggests separately that Africa may have also held populations we haven't found the bones yet at all. We're planting that idea here, deliberately, without chasing it further. The tools for actually reading that genetic signal properly come later, in a different part of this series. So, a hominin that shouldn't be as recent as it is, a furious, unresolved fight over what it was doing in that cave, and a hint, genetic rather than skeletal, that Africa's cast of characters may even be larger than the bones that have been shown to us. The bush, by this point, isn't just wide. It's still actively, right now, refusing to fully reveal its own shape. Alright, if you grew up with any version of the story at all, you probably grew up with a single place attached to it. A cradle, singular, one valley, one region, one lucky population that got it right first, and everyone alive today descending from that one specific spot. Here's where that fossil actually turns up. Morocco. Not East Africa, not the Rift Valley where we spent an entire section establishing as this story's great engine, the northwest corner of the continent, at a site called Jebel Arhoud, where fossils showing a face and skull recognizably close to a modern humans, though not yet identical to yours in every detail, have been dated to roughly 300,000 years old. That date alone pushed the known age of our species back further than older accounts of this story used to claim. But the location is doing just as much as the work as the date. If you walked in expecting a single African birthplace, Jebel Arhoud is telling you that's not always the same picture. It's not the whole picture. It's not the only piece of it either. Turn back east to Ethiopia and you'll find sites like Homo and Herto. Exactly the kind of East African fossils an older version of the story would have told you the whole answer. They matter, they're real, and they're not being written out here, but they sit alongside Jebel now, not above it. One node in a wider picture, not the picture's only center. Turn south, farther than either of those, to Floresbad in South Africa, and you'll find another piece of that same puzzle. Modern-ish human remains, again, not perfectly identical to the person alive today, clearly part of the same broader story, again, nowhere near the single spot older textbooks used to point to. Morocco, Ethiopia, South Africa, 3 different regions, 3 different corners of an enormous continent, all producing evidence of the same emerging species at roughly the same broad stretch of time. So here's the model that currently best explains what these 3 places together are actually showing us. Not a single population in a single valley, gradually perfecting itself and then spreading outward to replace everyone else. Instead, something more like a network, multiple populations spread across the African continent, separated enough by distance and time to develop some real regional differences between them, but never so separated that they stopped exchanging genes with each other entirely. Traits and populations moving back and forth across the continent, blending, diverging, blending again over tens of thousands of years, until what emerged wasn't the product of one lucky place, but the whole network working all at once. This is one of the leading scientific models for how our species came together, and it is exactly that, a model. Current and well supported, but not chiseled in stone for all time. This is a genuinely recent shift on how researchers think about this period, but it's built substantially on discoveries like Jebel, and it will be very likely to keep sharpening as more evidence comes in. There was no single Eden. There was no lucky valley, no one population that got there first while everyone else waited to be replaced. Instead, wildly separated populations across the continent contributed to the processes over a long stretch of time. That doesn't mean every population looked identical, or that the modern pattern arrived everywhere at the same moment. Real anatomical variation persisted for a long time, even as this broader pattern took hold. By this point, the recognizably modern human form had existed, not in one place, but across Africa. Humanity had no single birthplace. The continent itself was the cradle. What these humans would go on to leave behind, that's a different story for a different day.